Hello and welcome to my channel NB Soundhopper UK, and the subject of this video will be 2024 minus 50, my favourite 10 albums from 1974. 1974, 50 years ago, the year which saw the emergence of disco and the beginning of the end of glam rock. In the UK singles charts, it was the year of performers such as Terry Jacks, Paper Lace, the Rubettes, Mud and Barry White, plus newbies like the Bay City Rollers and ABBA. If you've watched either of the videos going over my favourite 10 studio albums and favourite 10 live albums, it should come as no surprise that none of the performers I've mentioned feature in my list. Without further ado, on to the nitty gritty, my favourite 10 albums from 1974. Number 10 is Secret Treaties by the Blue Oyster Cult. Career of Evil, Subhuman, Dominance and Submission, ME262, KG Cretins, Harvester of Eyes, Flaming Telepaths, Astronomy. Every track is a winner on this album and the sequence order is brilliant. It's a personal opinion, but I think sequencing is an important and quite often overlooked skill. Sometimes it makes the difference between an album being a bunch of decent tracks thrown together and something that is greater than the sum of its parts. Without doubt, my favourite Blue Oyster Cult album. Number 9, Sheer Heart Attack by Queen. Speaking of, without doubt, my favourite, etc., amongst Queen's albums, Sheer Heart Attack stands out for me. To some extent, there is a degree of nostalgia and sentimentality associated with that view. I was with a friend when he bought this album, and after going back to his house to listen to it, I was mightily impressed with the idea that tracks on a rock album could flow into one another in a medley, as they do between Tenement Funster, Flick of the Wrist, and Lily of the Valley. I'd heard very few albums up to this point, and my experience of listening to music was mostly confined to singles. So this medley opened my eyes to the greater potential that existed with albums. Of the singles from Sheer Heart Attack, Killer Queen and Now I'm Here were both known quantities, and both I liked. The remaining tracks are all enjoyable too and exhibit, perhaps for the first time, some of the band's versatility when you compare tracks like Brighton Rock, Bring Back That Leroy Brown, In the Lap of the Gods, and Misfire. Number 8, Blau by Konrad Schnitzler. This is an album with a very raw approach to electronic music. Konrad Schnitzler doesn't make a grand attempt to emulate the sounds of electric or acoustic instruments with his synths. Instead, he goes for a sound which is unashamedly electronic, and consequently, this is more an absorbing album than an easily accessible one. That's fine by me, and I get the feeling that a number of industrial bands at the end of the 1970s and in the early 1980s, as well as the likes of Auteca and Pansonic in the 1990s and moving on into the 21st century, may well have thought the same. The original album contains just 2 tracks, Die Rebellen haben sich in dem Bergen versteckt, which translated from German to English roughly means the rebels are hiding in the mountains, plus Jupiter, which translated from German to English roughly means Jupiter. Both tracks have industrial, disorientating and dissonant qualities, and the bonus tracks on the CD, White Space Parts 1 to 6, continue in similar fashion, maybe even more aggressively so. Throughout all the tracks, though, Konrad Schnitzler demonstrates a great sense of rhythm, and it's this that holds the tracks together and keeps the album interesting. Number 7, Autobahn by Kraftwerk. A turning point for Kraftwerk was reached with this album. On side one's title track, you have 22 minutes of melodic, rhythmic, accessible electronic music, which in many respects is in direct contrast to Blau by Konrad Schnitzler. Its accessibility and slightly playful feel found a very receptive audience for this type of sound, out of which many would go on to form their own bands playing music inspired by Kraftwerk. The second side is one of contrast. Cometon Melody Ein and Mitternacht are much darker with broody, bassy notes, whereas Cometon Melodies Vi is more in the style of side one. The final track, Morgen's Spaziergang, which is Morning Walk in English, emphasises the turning point for Kraftwerk I mentioned, as it is closest to the type of sound they had prior to this album, with its combination of synth, electric piano, and flute. It could almost be described as pastoral. Number 6, Hall of the Mountain Grill by Hawkwind. Following on from the double live album Space Ritual, Hall of the Mountain Grill saw changes to Hawkwind's lineup, with singer Robert Calvert having left to pursue a solo career, and Dick Mick, who provided electronic effects, being replaced by the more versatile keyboard and electric violin player Simon House, whose CV included albums recorded with both High Tide and the Third Ear Band. An album with a good mix in terms of track styles. There are harder rocking tracks like the psychedelic Warlords, Disappear in Smoke, and Lost Johnny. Psychedelic sounding tracks like D Rider and Webweaver, and instrumentals like Wind of Change and the title track, both of which do a good job in showcasing just what Simon House brought to the band. In terms of track lengths, it's a lot leaner than Hawkwind's previous albums, but that doesn't undermine it. In fact, I'd say that this was the most balanced studio album they'd recorded up to that point. Number 5, Diamond Dogs by David Bowie. A mashup of a Ziggy Stardust musical which never quite got off the ground, George Orwell's 1984, and William S. Burroughs' visions of futuristic decay, this album marks David Bowie's farewell to glam rock. Not that this is a glam rock album as such. The single taken from the album Rebel Rebel and side 2 opener Rock and Roll With Me certainly are, but the rest of it stretches ambitiously out a bit further. The prose of Future Legend sets the scene before leading into the dystopian title track. The next section of Sweet Thing Candidate and Sweet Thing Reprise sees Bowie writing lyrics in the cut-up style which Burroughs had used, and its music gives it all a feeling of something being described that's gradually falling out of Bowie's control. An allusion to his growing cocaine habit, perhaps. Side 2 is where the inspiration from Orwell kicks in with tracks like We Are the Dead, 1984, and Big Brother. Final track, Chant of the Ever-Circling Skeletal Family, provides a suitably dark ending to what is not quite a concept album, which is a fairly easy listen despite the dark subject matter. Number 4, Crime of the Century by Supertramp. In the 1970s, the idea of there being singles performers and bands and albums performers and bands was fairly ingrained. However, there were a few that had a foot comfortably planted in each camp. The aforementioned Queen and David Bowie, as well as Roxy Music, 10cc and Supertramp. Crime of the Century did a great deal to bring Supertramp to wider public attention, with the tracks Dreamer getting into the top 20 of the UK singles chart, and Bloody Well Right cracking the Billboard top 40 in the United States. Opening track School starts slowly but builds towards a higher tempo piano solo and an intense finish. It sets the tone for the album not just musically but lyrically too, with many of the tracks focusing on frustration and emotional insecurity. Overall, an album which is sophisticated but very accessible. Number 3, Kimono My House by Sparks. My first experience of hearing Sparks was watching them perform This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us on Top of the Pops, the first track on this album. Visually, they were great. Russell Mael with his falsetto singing and dynamic theatrical movements. In hilarious contrast, his nerdy looking keyboard playing brother Ron Mael sitting behind his keyboard in shirt and tie, sporting a Hitler moustache. This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us, I still think of as a cracking song on a lively, energetic, slightly oddball album with witty and clever lyrics. Although unable to find much of an audience in their homeland, the United States, Sparks' quirky take on glam rock made them much more successful in the UK. This quirkiness, along with the other attributes I've described, almost gives Kimono My House a kind of proto-punk feel. At no point do the band try and take themselves too seriously, and it's a fun listen. Number 2, Captain Lockheed and the Starfighters by Robert Calvert. As mentioned earlier, Robert Calvert had left Hawkwind to go it alone, although he rejoined and left again later in the 1970s. This is his first album, though, and it's a concept album about the German Air Force's decision to purchase a modified version of the Lockheed F-104G Starfighter and the disaster that followed. In time, it acquired the nickname Widowmaker because of the high pilot mortality rate due to more than 250 out of just over 900 planes crashing in accidents. The album mixes ridiculously funny satirical spoken parts and straightforward rock tracks containing well thought out lyrics. And Robert Calvert enlisted quite a who's who of the UK-based countercultural rock scene to perform on it, including several members of Hawkwind and the Pink Fairies, as well as Arthur Brown, Brian Eno, Jim Capaldi and Vivian Stanshall. To my mind, a must-have album for any Hawkwind fan. Number 1, Relayer by Yes. Being number 7 in my favourite 10 studio albums means that I've already rabbited on about Relayer. So apart from saying that the 3 tracks on the album, The Gates of Delirium, Sound Chaser and To Be Over are all excellent, the only thing I'll add now is about its cover, or more specifically, the photo of the band on the inside of the gatefold sleeve. It does make me laugh a little bit. There they all are looking very thoughtful, and I can't help but wonder what they were discussing when the photo was taken. The merits of love and peace, maybe. The trials and tribulations of being a tax exile, perhaps. Call me a cynic, but I'm going for the latter. There you have it, my favourite 10 albums from 1974. As ever, regardless of whether you liked or disliked this video, please give it a thumbs up or down as you see fit. Any comments left regarding the video would be greatly appreciated, especially considering I've received none to date. If you want to be notified when I next release a video, please click on the subscribe button. So if you've made it this far, thank you for watching.